Taking on a Love Supreme. Background. In a single session on December 9th, 1964, the John Coltrane Quartet recorded the album that is considered to be his masterpiece and is one of the most highly regarded jazz albums of all time, A Love Supreme. The album is a 4-part suite, conceived as a humble offering of thanks to God for a spiritual awakening Coltrane experienced in 1957. Throughout the 1950s, John Coltrane was a rising star on the tenor saxophone, but he also struggled with alcohol and heroin addiction. That all changed in 1957 when, between stints in the Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk bands, he got clean and redevoted himself to perfecting his playing through fervent and diligent practice. From that point until the end of his life, 10 years later, Coltrane produced his greatest and most enduring work. He played on what is arguably the greatest jazz album of all time, Miles Davis's 1959 masterpiece, Kind of Blue, then went on to record a series of highly regarded albums as a band leader. Among those albums were Blue Train for Blue Note Records in 1958, and several legendary recordings for Atlantic in 1960 and 1961, including Giant Steps. Later in 1961, he signed with Creed Taylor's new label, Impulse Records, where his style would rapidly evolve until his death in 1967 at the age of 40. The spiritual quest driving that rapid stylistic evolution arguably peaked on that day in December 1964, when his quartet, with McCoy Tyner on piano, Jimmy Garrison on bass, and Elvin Jones on drums, came together at the legendary Van Gelder Studio in New Jersey and brought A Love Supreme to life. Despite its broad popularity, A Love Supreme is not something you hear performed live very often. Even though Part 2, Resolution, made its way into Volume 4 of the real book, and all 4 parts are, with varying levels of accuracy and completeness, transcribed in the Trane Book, these are pieces that rarely get called to jam sessions or covered by other jazz musicians, on record or in performance. And yet, at my suggestion, my band is attempting to do it. But why? Well, that's a good question. It's really the same impulse that drives us to play any classic piece of music, to achieve a greater understanding, or just because we like it. I'm not suggesting there's any way we can truly do justice to the work or add anything to its value, but by studying and performing it, we honor and celebrate it, and hopefully celebrate Coltrane's intentions. So, let's study it. The essence of A Love Supreme. To further probe that question of why, I want to distill A Love Supreme down to its essential elements, to make it both easier to play and easier to understand as a listener. But how do we know what its essential elements are? There's no published score. How could there be with so much of it improvised? There are other musicians out there with more patient, highly attuned, and experienced ears than mine, who have created meticulous transcriptions of this music. But while I feel those are great tools to study in developing technical skill on your instrument, they're not the most helpful for understanding the structure of the music. I think back to my earlier video that looked at John McLaughlin's listening scores for Mahavishnu Orchestra. The 2-measure score he produced for Earthship would be extremely difficult to follow as a performer, and it doesn't include any transcriptions of the solos. But it's a great tool for a listener to follow along with the recording and understand how the various elements of the composition fit together. That's my goal here. Without hunting down those meticulous transcriptions, exactly the kind of work I had to do for my college thesis on Coltrane's various recordings of My Favorite Things back in 1996, what do we have readily at our disposal to study A Love Supreme? Here's what I used. Coltrane's original early sketch for the piece, which I found on a post on Open Culture. The, let's call them, approximate and incomplete transcriptions contained in the Trane Book, published by Hal Leonard. A set of more accurate transcriptions, not really accurate full stop, but more accurate, and with no attribution given to the transcriber, also published by Hal Leonard, which I found on Sheet Music Direct. Coltrane's own liner notes and poem from the LP release. Recordings. The original studio version, plus 3 live versions recorded in France and Seattle, and numerous studio outtakes by both the quartet and a sextet supplemented by Archie Shepp and Art Davis, collected on a handful of more recent box sets. I find listening to these alternate versions and live recordings to be the most instructive, even if I'm not going to bother to study them meticulously. They show how much the compositions were really just sketches to give the group a general direction for collective improvisation. To the best of my knowledge, those actual sketches Coltrane brought to the quartet on December 9th, 1964 are not publicly available. But I'm trying to imagine what those sketches might have been, or, more realistically, to produce my own, slightly more detailed sketches in a form that works for me and my band. We are not the John Coltrane Quartet. Coltrane's original sketch. Coltrane's original sketch of 4 parts, or movements if we want to think of this as the jazz analog of a symphony, includes most of the key ideas, but the final product is quite different. Part 1 is in a different key. What's initially called Part 2 actually became Part 3, instead of Part 3 being entirely a bass solo. Various other details throughout had changed by the time of the recording, and of course, a whole new Part 2 had been invented. But like I said, the essence is there. Part 1 starts with the horn cadenza outlining an E sus2 arpeggio, with the notes written, transposed for tenor sax, followed by the famous 4-note motif representing the phrase, "A Love Supreme." After a horn melody and solos, the motif is played in all keys, followed by vocal chants. Part 2, really Part 3, is a blues form, followed by a bass solo that leads into Part 4, a somber and out-of-time musical recitation of Coltrane's prayer from the album's liner notes that, per the sketch, is reminiscent of Coltrane's earlier work, Alabama. The Trane Book. The Trane Book is part of the Real Book series, published after Hal Leonard acquired the rights to create legal versions of the popular and notoriously inaccurate series of fake books. Hal Leonard's Real Books may be legal, and they definitely have cleaned up some of the errors in earlier bootleg versions, but they're still only rough approximations of what's on a record, and sometimes their chord changes really don't make sense. Still, I'm not a full-time musician, and if there's a shortcut available, I'll take it. The Trane Book includes all 4 parts of A Love Supreme, so it was a good place for me to start. But it didn't take long before I noticed problems. I'll probably spend too much of the remainder of this video nitpicking them. The overall form. A Love Supreme consists of 4 parts outlining Coltrane's journey from his initial spiritual awakening through his work both to overcome his addictions and to perfect his saxophone playing, and finally to an understanding of his relationship to God. As I hear it, the 4 parts correlate roughly to these phases in the journey. Part 1, Acknowledgement, is the spiritual awakening. Part 2, Resolution, is the battle with his addictions and a determination to find a renewed sense of purpose. Part 3, Pursuance, is striving to attain absolute virtuosity on his instrument. And Part 4, Psalm, is the prayer. As I studied the transcriptions, I also realized that, for as out there as this album gets, the 4 parts are actually fairly recognizable forms, and in fact echo some of Coltrane's earlier work. In his 2015 Pitchfork review of A Love Supreme, The Complete Masters, Mark Richardson addresses how Coltrane was at a pivot point between music that had broad appeal and the more searching and far less accessible work that would soon follow in 1965. A Love Supreme was an expression of a very specific time and place, a conscious attempt by Coltrane to communicate something to his audience that was broad enough to be understood, but rich and complex enough to honor both where he was as a musician and the depth of the subject matter. So, I think Coltrane went back to his past to find familiar forms to underpin the 4 parts of A Love Supreme, at least as a starting point for listeners to grab hold of before the group collectively plunged them into the abyss. Specifically, Part 1 is in a mid-tempo Afro-Latin style, with a modal harmony alternating between 2 chords. I feel like the track from his earlier discography it bears the closest resemblance to is Out of This World from the 1962 album Coltrane. The drum groove and piano chords also remind me a bit of his treatment of the standard The Night Has a Thousand Eyes from Coltrane's Sound, which was recorded in 1960 but wasn't released until mid-1964. And even though it's swing, not Latin, I feel like the modal elements suggest a connection to Coltrane's influential composition, Impressions. Part 2 is an up-tempo swing, with a syncopated ostinato in the rhythm section. It resembles the feel of Coltrane's 1960 reimagining of George Gershwin's Summertime, or his 1961 original Olé, as well as Wayne Shorter's composition Free For All. Could it really be inspired by Free For All, though? Maybe. While Free For All was recorded in early 1964, it wasn't released until 6 months after A Love Supreme. But the Jazz Messengers surely were performing it live in 1964. Musicians listened to other musicians, and Trane almost certainly was interested in what Wayne Shorter had to say. Although it can be hard to get a grasp on its harmonic structure on the first or even 100th listen, Part 3 is, wait for it, a 12-bar blues, which I think makes perfect sense as the form for Coltrane to use here. It's where so much of jazz and much other 20th century music started. But is there a particular 12-bar blues from earlier in his discography that it's inspired by? I find its bold melodic statement on top of a busy rhythm section a bit reminiscent of Cousin Mary, a Blues from the Giant Steps album. That still feels like a bit of a stretch, though. Pursuance is simultaneously the most familiar jazz song form and like nothing anyone has ever heard before. I think that's what Coltrane was going for. The album ends with Part 4, Psalm, a free-time meditation that closely resembles Coltrane's earlier composition, Alabama, written as a memorial to the victims of a racially motivated church bombing in Birmingham in September 1963. Coltrane's own sketch for A Love Supreme explicitly indicates the connection between the two, and it's easy to understand both of them as a form of prayer. Part 1, Acknowledgement. Okay, time to put on my music theory hat. The Trane Book has the chords for this part notated as alternating between F minor 11 and G minor 7 over F minor 7. Not over F, indicating a different note in the bass, but over F minor 7, indicating a polychord. I mean, just why? As he often did in this period, McCoy-Tyner is employing quartal harmony here, chords built on stacked fourths, rather than the more common stacked thirds of traditional Western harmony. As I hear it, the first chord is F, B flat, E flat, A flat. And the second chord is G, C, F, B flat. It's reasonable to call the first chord an F minor 11, but I would never call the second one G minor 7 over F minor 7, unless there are some additional notes I'm not hearing. Then, I guess. I've also seen the first chord notated as F minor 7 sus 4, which makes more sense to me, so I'd go with that. The second chord could likewise be notated as G minor 7 sus 4. But that implies a scale that includes A natural, which you definitely would want to avoid here. Is that why the Trane Book has it as a G minor 7 over F minor 7? Perhaps, but that does nothing to clarify the fact that these are quartal chords. There really just isn't a good way to indicate quartal harmony with standard chord symbols. Anyway, if you line up all the notes in these two chords, you end up with F, G, A flat, B flat, C, E flat. That's an F minor scale, minus the 6th degree. I tried playing both a D natural and a D flat against the recording to see which one seemed to fit. And honestly, I'd probably avoid both of them when soloing, but I slightly favored D natural. As for the two sources I'm using, they're not much help here. The Trane Book has a key signature of 3 flats, E flat major or F Dorian, with a D natural. The other transcription, transposed for tenor sax, has 2 flats. That would be 4 flats in concert pitch, A flat major or F natural minor, aka Aeolian mode, with a D flat. Looking at the actual notes of the transcriptions, Coltrane also avoids both D and D flat, and is basically working within an F minor pentatonic scale. That's reinforced by the one academic source I took the time to cite here, Dr. Lewis Porter, a retired Rutgers music professor and author of a book on John Coltrane. In an excerpt from his book that appeared in the February 1998 issue of Downbeat magazine, he discusses the intentional relationship between the tonal centers of the 4 parts, F, E flat, B flat, C, and mentions F minor pentatonic as the basis of the melody in part 1. I had initially developed a lengthy argument that the root of the bass ostinato is actually B flat, not F. But everything I just said, and more importantly, playing the music, in the form of the jam you hear in the background, helped me to understand how F really is the root, even though the bass line does seem to be driving to B flat. Okay, that's enough music theory for now. The Trane Book's version also only barely hints at the saxophone melody, after devoting over half of the piece's single page to the intro. The 8 bars it does give start with what I believe is the true essence of the melody, just a 2-bar phrase intended as a launching pad for improvisation. The next 4 bars are what my wife would call the Dum Dum Baby version, a grossly oversimplified transcription of Trane's improvised melody. The final 2 bars are useful though, as they're the moment when he first references the melodic fragment that will become the foundation of part 3. As I put my arrangement together for my band, I initially went with the more accurate transcription, but it proved difficult for us to pull off convincingly. That was when I realized we needed to treat the material the way Coltrane treated it. I went back and restructured the tenor melody so it's just that basic 2-bar phrase repeated with instructions to embellish freely. I did keep that part 3 fragment though. Part 2, Resolution. Resolution is the only part of A Love Supreme that appears in one of the general Real Book volumes, and it's not hard to understand why. It has the most distinctive melody, a mysterious and compelling one at that, and it follows a more traditional jazz song form, with a head, solos over the changes, and a return to the head at the end. Perhaps that's why the version in the Trane Book actually matches very closely the detailed transcription. Of course, there are predictable deviations between the two in the chord progression. Here in my own arrangement, I took some liberties with both the chord changes and the bass line to account for the fact that my band does not have a piano player or any chordal instrument. I love the energy of songs like this. Olé, Trane's version of Summertime, Free for All. In fact, my band has already performed those last 2, with Summertime, in the style of Coltrane, playing a prominent role in my rather insane mashup extravaganza, 4 Seasons. Part 3, Pursuance. After an extended drum solo intro, here comes the 12-bar blues, if you can manage to pick it out, as well as the restatement of that melodic fragment introduced in Part 1. And here, surprisingly, the Trane Book does a fairly decent job with both the melody and the chord changes. I think they really should have skipped the second chorus, though. I don't believe Coltrane had that written out. It's just a liberal embellishment of the main melody stated in the first chorus. At least it's an accurate transcription. True to the theme of Pursuance, this is a one-way journey. The head never returns, and each player in the band gets a chance to stretch out and make a statement. Things wind down with a bass solo that segues directly into the final part. Part 4, Psalm. And now, as the journey ends, we're on a completely different plane. I'm not sure what, if any, direction Coltrane might have given the band for this one, other than C minor, out of time, just follow what I'm doing. Coltrane had written a prayer poem for this part, which appears in its entirety in the liner notes of the album. The listener is encouraged to follow along, as you realize that Coltrane is truly reciting the prayer, syllable for syllable, phrase for phrase, through his saxophone. It is the most fitting conclusion I can imagine for this intense piece of work. But how does a transcriber tackle something like this, and how does a band try to play it? The transcriptions in the Trane Book and from Sheet Music Direct are radically different in how they notate the rhythms, although the notes and the phrases are the same. And of course, once again, the Trane Book is incomplete. But since this is such an intensely personal statement, it doesn't really seem appropriate to try to recreate it note for note anyway. So in my version, I mostly relied on the interpretation from the Trane Book, and I also stopped where it stops, only about a quarter of the way through the poem, at the line, "It is most important that I know thee." From there, the poem and the playing gets more intense and more intensely personal, so it seems appropriate to move into improvisation. My version has the bass and percussion, played with mallets, providing an indistinct wash of color and harmony, as with the original. Since my band has 2 sax players, I have them trading off on the melodic transcription phrase by phrase, free to stretch the phrases as they wish. After we reach the end of the transcription, each sax player takes a turn at a solo, with the rhythm section continuing as before, alternating between C minor and A flat major, and gradually fading out. What have I learned? You mean besides the fact that I maybe shouldn't have even attempted to take this on? I've learned a lot, honestly. First off, I have even more reverence than before for the talents of all 4 of the musicians involved with this album. Even Jimmy Garrison, who at times sounds a little bit lost to me. I got a valuable reminder to take anything I find in a real book with a grain of salt. But I think mostly I achieved what I was looking for, which was a greater understanding of how this sprawling work is structured. And even more importantly, how it is fundamentally a tribute not just to John Coltrane's understanding of his relationship to God, but to jazz as a means of expressing that relationship. When you step back and look at the 4 parts of A Love Supreme, what the foundational elements are, and just how much can be built on top of those elements, it's hard to feel anything other than reverence. One more thing. There's one critical factor in the story of A Love Supreme that I have mostly sidestepped up to this point. This is art that is expressing the Black experience in America. It's a means of finding joy and hope, even in a place that doesn't want to let you have either. I will never be able to fully understand that experience, no matter how much I study it. I'm just hopeful that my own work undertaken here treats it with the respect it deserves and elevates it. The fact is, racism is a white problem, and until white people, like me, acknowledge that and do the hard work on ourselves to make things better, that problem will never go away. At this point, it might be easy to accuse me of everything from cultural appropriation to virtue signaling to self-flagellation. So be it. Since I first undertook an in-depth study of Coltrane's work for my undergraduate thesis almost 3 decades ago, it was obvious to me that it's impossible to understand jazz without confronting racism in America. I don't think that means I don't have the right to listen to this music or to play it, but it does mean that if I'm going to do either, I have to do it with intention and with contextual awareness.